Hello again. My name is Steve Hillis, and we're beginning to wind down on our lecture series on Major Sociological Perspectives. Up to this point, we've talked about two major sociological, macro-sociological perspectives. We've talked about conflict theories or the conflict perspective. We've talked about functionalism, and we've also talked about one major approach to micro-sociology, interactionism. Now, we'd like to take a step back and kind of compare and contrast these different perspectives or paradigms a little bit. Now, in the earlier lectures, I've lectured at you a lot. Here, I want to take a little different approach. Rather than fill in all the details, I'm just going to try to point out a few things that you can do to make better distinctions between these theories, because you're going to need to be able to distinguish between them. It's something that's going to come up repeatedly on tests all the way through the final. Part of understanding these theories is understanding how they're different, being able to identify one kind of an application of conflict theories and arguments as opposed to arguments and assumptions that are more closely associated with, say, interactionism. You have to be able to pull them apart, see how they're different. Now, how do you do that? It's not always easy because these perspectives can be pretty abstract and there's a lot of stuff there. I sympathize. I also know, frankly, that sometimes the boundaries between these perspectives can get a little fuzzy. Sometimes it's not easy to tell whether you're talking about an interactionist perspective or a conflict perspective or a functionalist perspective. I understand that sometimes these things can run together a little bit, but I can still give you some suggestions, some hints to how to begin to pull them apart, and I can encourage you strongly to spend a little time thinking more carefully, not just about what each one of these theories are, but also how they're different from one another, so that you can recognize examples of one versus examples of another, so that you can distinguish between them. Now, what kinds of hints? Well, first of all, look at who you're, if you see a test question and it's about Karl Marx or Max Weber, those are people that we associate very closely with conflict theory. Sometimes you can just look at who you're looking at and you can already get a sense of which approach, because those were famous conflict theorists. Well, if you're talking about Emil Durkheim, well, that's somebody we associate much more with functionalism. Or Talcott Parsons or Robert Merton. Those were all famous functionalists. So if we're citing their arguments and ideas, chances are we're probably talking about functionalist arguments or ideas. Likewise, if we talk about people like George Herbert Mead, Cooley, Bloomer, people of that order, we're probably talking about interactionists. And again, I'm not giving you every last name, but as you go through this course, look at what names come up over and over again when we talk about conflict theory, when we talk about functionalism, when we talk about interactionism. Look at your book. In these sections, you'll see them talking about specific thinkers, researchers, theorists. Come to understand who's associated with which approach. And that gives you a really strong clue when you're reading a test question, well, which perspective is this focusing on? But there's really a more direct way that doesn't require you memorizing names or faces. Look at what kinds of arguments and ideas are being emphasized, and this is a big one. If it's emphasizing ideas or arguments, if a question is emphasizing things like power, conflict, inequality, social change, those kinds of emphasis tend to be associated much more closely with conflict theory. Now, I got to be careful, because sometimes it's not that simple. Just to give you one counterexample, later in the semester, when we talk about social stratification, we're going to talk about Davis and Moore's functionalist theory or functionalist model of stratification. That is a functionalist theory, but it is about inequality. So don't always just instantly jump in with that, well, this idea, inequality equals conflict theory. It's not quite that simple. But usually when somebody's talking about, well, this thing produces more inequality or inequality causes these problems, those kinds of arguments are much more closely associated with conflict theory in more cases than not, as opposed to other theories. So it's a clue. Not necessarily the end of the issue, but something that kind of points you in the right direction. Now, if you're talking about functionalism, or you're talking about more about emphasis on things like social order, stability, maybe more focus on concepts like social norms, social values, and so forth. What it is that allows society to work better, harmoniously, allowing things to get done, and so forth. When those kinds of issues, concepts, ideas are stressed, you're more likely to be talking about functionalism. And finally, when you're looking at social meaning, social definition, social interaction, that's the emphasis. Those are some of the core concepts or concerns being discussed. You're probably talking about interactionism. The point is you can kind of look at what variables are being discussed, what assumptions, what concepts, and already get very strong clues which perspective is being emphasized. Also, another big clue is whether you're looking at large-scale social phenomena or small-scale social phenomena. If you're talking about the study of vast numbers of people, very large-scale patterns of social activity, you're probably either talking about functionalism or conflict theory. Now, you're still going to have to figure out which one of those it is, but if it's a macro-sociological issue or question, it's probably going to be one of them. On the other hand, if you're looking at small group behavior, micro-sociological perspectives and issues, you're probably looking at interactionism. You can kind of look at whether you're looking at macro or micro level questions, and that too will give you a strong clue. Also, you can look at the styles of logic or argument. That's a really nice way of distinguishing between, say, conflict theory and interactionism. If you have somebody who's arguing, or you have a question that's claiming that something contributes to the overall society, makes things work better, produces more social stability, order, allows society to survive, and so forth, it contributes positively to the larger social world. That's the method of analysis. That's the emphasis. You're probably talking about a functionalist. On the other hand, if you have somebody who's saying, well, the reason that this happens, the reason the social world is organized in this way, is because it serves the interests of powerful groups of people. It serves the rich, it serves capitalists, and so forth. When they begin to talk about winners and losers, the social world working the way it does, looking the way it does, because it serves the interest of well-organized, powerful, well-connected groups. When that is the style of argument or analysis, you're much more likely to be looking at conflict theories. Finally, when you hear them looking more at focusing on things like social meaning, shared meaning, the social self, and so forth, when you begin to look at emphasizing how people perceive things, how other people influence how you perceive things. When you begin to focus much more on perception and social meaning, those kinds of issues, that's probably much more about interactionism. Now, when you look at your book, you're going to get a lot more feedback on each of these particular theories or perspectives, and you're also going to get quite a few more clues about how to distinguish between them. But at the end of the day, there's only one way for you to really get a good sense of it, which means that you're going to have to work at it. You're going to have to think a little bit about what these perspectives are and how they're different. My last, well, I won't say it's a hint, my last suggestion is to think that each of these different perspectives is a different way of looking at society, looking at people, looking at human nature. They make different assumptions about human nature. They ask different questions. They focus on different variables. And they often come to different conclusions. Once you really get a sense out of how each of these perspectives views the social world, it'll be pretty easy to tell them apart. And while you might get confused occasionally, most times it's going to come, well, that fast. At any rate, that's going to finish up this video. We have one more video to do where we're going to look a lot more at social remedies or solutions that are often associated with these major sociological perspectives. Again, this video is targeted much more at my social problems class and the intro class, but since it still does cover major sociological perspectives, I will include it for my Social 100 class to watch. So we'll see you then. We'll see you in the next video. Thank you very much.